Hello 6303. In this video we're going to continue discussing the review of literature, and we're going to look at the examples of the critique of empirical studies section and the gaps in the literature section. You will need to write these after you have written out your themes.
We'll be working with Ludington's proposal again, so go ahead and go into the Module 3 folder and pull that up, or if you printed it off, pull that out of your files.
I want you to read the critique of empirical studies before I start breaking it down. If we read the first paragraph, both qualitative and quantitative research addressing the significance of creating an LGBT inclusive school environment were abundant in this review of literature. Hinshaw provided valuable information on the success of LGBT teacher training in regards to lowering the rate of LGBT bullying in schools. Although this study is from England, it shows that education and training could possibly make a positive difference in the United States as well. When we tear apart this paragraph, we'll see that she analyzed that there were both qualitative and quantitative research on her topic, and she cited which studies she looked at that were qualitative and which studies she looked at that were quantitative. This sentence also sets us up for this section. It serves as an introduction to her critique of empirical studies. In the rest of the section, she continues to tell us what types of studies were conducted, but she gets more specific in the body paragraphs. And you'll see that she focuses a lot on where the studies were conducted. She has some done in England. She talks about other international research. She talks about Canada. And the reason she talks about this is because she's noticing that there's not a lot done in the United States. And when we look at her gaps section, she's going to tell us that. She then continues to talk about these studies that were conducted internationally by going and breaking down what types of instruments were used. And we see that in the Goldstein study, the researcher used journal entries and interview questions to assess changes for educators before, during, and after training sessions and implementation. She also shows that the researchers requested further research on personal conflicts interfering with intervention. This is a suggestion for future research that was noted in the Goldstein article. In the last sentence of this paragraph, she states that Graytech et al. Found that the most successful route to overcoming these personal conflicts is through appealing to teacher empathy. Right here, she is stating the results of one of those qualitative studies that focused on journal entries, interview questions, and observations. She then goes on to talk about a quantitative study. She talks about the methods, it was purposeful sampling, and the results. By making this connection, the school district used the law for a noble cause to protect and promote all students. She breaks down another qualitative study about intersectionality and talks about the results. She talks about Moe's study and what the focus of it was, and again goes and hits on those suggestions for future research. And she continues talking about the focus of the studies that she looked at. In the last paragraph, she summarizes what else was looked at in the research. Links between staff members' fears, personal conflicts, lack of confidence with likelihood of educator intervention is overwhelmingly discussed, so we know that is plentiful. And she also tells us that the importance of creating an LGBT inclusive environment was plentiful in the research. In the last sentence of the section, she preps us again for the gaps of literature by saying, however, the focus of forming a truly LGBT inclusive school environment needs more in-depth and rich qualitative study in the United States schools, focusing on the effect of LGBT inclusive curriculum implementation. So in conclusion, the critique of empirical studies should have an introductory sentence or paragraph that tells us what the section will be about. It should have the types of studies read for the review of literature discussed. Were they qualitative? Were they quantitative? It should also discuss the data collection methods and or instruments used in the studies that you read for the review of literature. Did the qualitative studies use interviews, observations, journaling, videos, etc.? Did the quantitative studies use a t-test, a survey, ANOVA, correlational design, etc.? And the final thing you should discuss in your critique of empirical studies are the results of the studies read for the review of literature. Were the results statistically significant or not? If it was quantitative, were they generalizable? Or if it was qualitative, what themes emerged from the research? The length of your critique of empirical studies section is going to vary according to how many studies you looked at. Remember that the minimum is 10, but for many of you, 10 isn't going to be enough. Jill had over 20 resources because she found an abundance of research on her topic. So that's why her critique of empirical studies is a full page and a half. I'm expecting you to have at least 2 paragraphs in there, minimum, more if you read more studies, because you're going to have to summarize the main point of each study and the instruments, methods, etc. If we move on to the gaps in the literature, you're going to see that this section directly connects to the critique of empirical studies. I want you to take a second to read through Jill's gaps in the literature section before we start taking it apart. Overall, there was a broad amount of research illustrating the relationship between implementing an LGBT inclusive school environment and a drop in LGBT bullying. So she's setting us up for this section by telling us what just happened, what she just talked about in her critique of empirical studies. She's telling us what was there. On the other hand, in the information located, the only fully LGBT inclusive school environments in place were in England and Canada. So right here, she's noting the gap, and her gap has to do with regions. It wasn't done in the United States. It was done in England and Canada. Notice the language that she uses here as well. She says, in the information located. The reason that Jill uses this language is because she knows that she hasn't read every single study out there, and she only had access to what was on the Cornell Library website or what popped up on Google Scholar. She didn't have a chance to visit different libraries across the country and look at their archives and what was on microfilm and all of that stuff. So the language in the information located is very important because she's telling the reader she knows she hasn't looked at everything. She knows that her scope was limited to the sources that were available to her. She also repeats what she said in the critique of empirical studies. However, although these schools were further in the LGBT inclusive environment process, this could be an indication that the same positive results would transpire in the U.S. if full inclusion takes place. Considering this train of thought, Graytack states that international research is needed in this area. So she's connecting the gap that she noticed to a suggestion for future research from one of the studies. However, it is important to consider that U.S. LGBT attitudes appear to differ greatly from England and Canada. For instance, Hershaw's report focused on $2 million in funding from the government was being contributed to combat LGBT bullying in England schools. On the other hand, Hanlon states that according to GLSEN's 2004 State of States report in the U.S., only 8 states and the District of Columbia provide legal protections for students based on sexual orientation. She notes that the literature stated there's an attitude difference between England and Canada and the United States. And she further concludes that Texas is not one of those 8 states. She continues saying spaces open for further investigation also include tailoring staff LGBT training sessions to role-specific job assignments. For instance, Graytack states that offering differing training sessions for administration, counselors, bus drivers, teachers, secretaries, custodial staff, etc. could make sessions more valuable and time efficient. So She's taking a suggestion straight from a study that she read, and she's telling that I noticed this same gap too. In addition, research showing how community sizes affects LGBT bullying could also be beneficial. And then she goes back to cite Hamlin, who said that in small towns, the majority of population stays the same, but no evidence was provided to back up this statement in any of the research located. And in the last paragraph, she says a good amount of useful information was uncovered and extremely helpful in this literature review. Also, a fairly balanced amount of both qualitative and quantitative based studies were located, allowing both in-depth and measured studies to be evaluated. She summarizes the types of studies and what information was available in those studies, and then the last sentence states the biggest gap. However, there still is a lack of in-depth knowledge on how LGBT inclusive curriculum implementation can play a crucial role in combating LGBT bullying in the United States. She identified a major gap in the research, and she is going to later connect this to her Chapter 1 rationale. Why do I need to do this study that I'm designing? How is this going to benefit the field, and what gap does this fill? She will address this when it comes time to write the rationale for Chapter 1 and when it comes time to form her research questions in Chapter 1. So if we look at the traits needed for the gaps in literature, we can see that the section should contain an introductory sentence or paragraph that tells what the section will be about, and it also identifies what gaps exist in the literature based on what was not seen in the critique of empirical studies. This is likely the smallest part of your review of literature, but it becomes the most important. In the next video, we'll discuss how to write the introduction for the review of literature, and we'll also talk about the chapter summary.